In the early hours of January 19th, 1809, as a winter storm battered the city of Boston, Massachusetts, Elizabeth Arnold Poe gave birth to her second son in a small back room of a modest boarding house on Carver Street, now Charles Street South. The child, whom she named Edgar, entered a world that would offer him little stability or comfort. Born into the itinerant life of traveling performers, his arrival was merely a brief intermission in the perpetual drama of his parents' theatrical careers. Neither Edgar nor his mother could have foreseen how this inauspicious beginning would eventually lead to literary immortality, or how the themes of loss, abandonment, and the search for identity that would define his life would also shape American literature forever. Edgar's parents, Elizabeth Arnold Poe and David Poe Jr., were both actors in a repertory company performing in Boston at the time of his birth. Elizabeth, born in England in 1787, had come to America as a child with her mother, also an actress. By the age of 9, following her mother's death, Elizabeth had already begun performing on stage. Beautiful, talented, and possessing a melodious singing voice, she became a popular figure in theaters along the eastern seaboard. David Poe, Jr., in contrast, had abandoned his studies in law against the wishes of his prominent Baltimore family to pursue a theatrical career for which he had considerably less natural aptitude. Their marriage in 1806 had united two very different personalities. She, disciplined and professional. He, erratic and given to excessive drinking. Edgar was not their first child. His older brother, William Henry Leonard Poe, had been born in January 1807 in Boston. The demands of theatrical life meant that the Poe family lived a nomadic existence, moving from city to city as performance engagements dictated. The first months of Edgar's life were spent traveling with his parents and brother as the theatrical company performed in various northeastern cities. This peripatetic lifestyle, while common for actors of the period, created an unstable foundation for family life and would have made the basic care of young children particularly challenging. In 1810, the Poe family continued their theatrical touring, with young Edgar accompanying his parents. The precise details of their movements during this year are not fully documented, but they likely performed in several cities along the eastern seaboard, including Philadelphia and New York. For Edgar, not yet 2 years old, these early experiences of constant movement and changing environments would have established a pattern of impermanence that would characterize much of his childhood. The family's already precarious situation deteriorated dramatically in 1811 when David Poe Jr. abandoned them, disappearing from their lives and from historical record. The circumstances of his departure remain unclear, whether it was due to the pressures of family responsibility, his struggles with alcoholism, personal conflicts with Elizabeth, or some combination of these factors. What is certain is that he left Elizabeth alone to care for their 2 young sons and to support the family through her theatrical work. She was also pregnant with their 3rd child at the time of his desertion, adding to her already considerable burden. In late 1811, the Placide and Green Company, a traveling acting troupe with which Elizabeth had previously performed, brought her and her children to Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, then a city of about 10,000 inhabitants, was the capital of Virginia and a center of culture and commerce in the South. It was here, in November 1811, that Elizabeth gave birth to her 3rd child, a daughter named Rosalie. The birth, coming so soon after her husband's abandonment and while continuing to perform to support her family, must have placed enormous physical and emotional strain on Elizabeth. The strain proved too great. By early December 1811, Elizabeth's health, likely compromised by years of hardship and the rigors of theatrical life, began to fail rapidly. She was suffering from consumption, tuberculosis, a common and deadly disease in the early 19th century. As her condition worsened, she could no longer perform, cutting off the family's sole source of income. Destitute and desperately ill, she and her children relied on the charity of the Richmond community. On December the 8th, 1811, Elizabeth Arnold Poe died of tuberculosis in Richmond, leaving Edgar, age 2, William Henry, age 4, and Rosalie, just a few weeks old, orphaned. Her death was reported in the Richmond newspapers, which praised her talents and character while noting the tragic circumstances of her passing. According to some accounts, her final days were spent in a garret room, lying on the straw, with her children beside her, a scene of abject poverty and suffering that contrasted sharply with the applause and admiration she had known on stage. The death of Elizabeth Poe set in motion a series of events that would permanently separate the 3 Poe children and shape the course of Edgar's life. In the days following her death, as the Richmond community responded to the plight of the orphaned children, decisions were made that would determine their futures. These decisions, made by adults with varying motivations and capacities for childcare, gave little consideration to maintaining the siblings' bonds with each other. A common approach in an era when the psychological importance of such connections was not widely recognized. Edgar, not yet 3 years old, was taken into the care of John and Frances Allan, a wealthy merchant couple in Richmond. John Allan was a Scottish-born tobacco merchant who had established a successful import-export business. He and his wife Frances, who had no children of their own, were among those who had visited the dying Elizabeth Poe and witnessed the children's desperate situation. Frances, in particular, was moved by the plight of the toddler Edgar and expressed a desire to care for him. While the Allans provided Edgar with material comfort and security that far exceeded what his biological parents could have offered, they never legally adopted him. This ambiguous status, neither fully a son nor merely a ward, would create tensions and uncertainties that would haunt Edgar throughout his relationship with John Allan. From the beginning, there seems to have been a difference in attachment between the Allans. Frances embraced Edgar with maternal affection, while John maintained a more reserved, sometimes critical stance toward the boy he had agreed to raise but not to legally claim. Meanwhile, Edgar's older brother William Henry Leonard Poe was sent to live with his paternal grandparents, David Poe Sr. and Elizabeth Cairns Poe, in Baltimore. The elderly couple, who had disapproved of their son's theatrical career and marriage, nevertheless took responsibility for raising their grandson. This separation from his brother, coming so soon after the loss of both parents, represented another severing of family bonds for Edgar, who was too young to understand the adult decisions that were reshaping his life, but would certainly have felt the emotional impact of these multiple losses. Edgar's young sister Rosalie was taken to the home of William and Jane Scott Mackenzie in Richmond. Like the Allans, the Mackenzies were a childless couple of means who could provide material security for the infant girl. Rosalie would grow up in Richmond, occasionally seeing her brother Edgar during his time with the Allans, but developing as a separate individual with her own distinct family context and experiences. The years 1812 to 1815 saw Edgar adjusting to life with the Allans in Richmond. Their home on Tobacco Row, in the affluent Court End district of the city, offered comforts and advantages that contrasted sharply with the precarious existence he had known with his theatrical parents. John Allan's business was prospering, and the family lived in a style befitting a successful merchant, with servants, fine furnishings, and social connections to Richmond's elite families. For young Edgar, this transition must have been complex and disorienting. While gaining material security and the affection of Frances Allan, he had lost his mother, been separated from his siblings, and been placed in an environment culturally and socially removed from the theatrical world of his birth parents. Though too young to fully comprehend these changes, the emotional impact of such profound disruption in his earliest years would likely have shaped his developing sense of self and security. John Allan, a self-made man with strong opinions about proper behavior and the value of practical industry, provided Edgar with a model of masculine success very different from that of his biological father. Allan expected discipline, obedience, and eventually a practical career orientation from the boy he was raising. These expectations would later clash with Edgar's more sensitive, imaginative temperament and his literary ambitions, creating tensions that would define much of his adolescence and early adulthood. Frances Allan, by all accounts, developed a deep and genuine affection for Edgar. Childless after several years of marriage, she embraced the opportunity to mother the orphaned boy, showing him tenderness and understanding that provided some emotional stability amid the disruptions of his early life. Her influence helped to soften John Allan's more stern approach to child-rearing and gave Edgar at least one secure attachment figure during these formative years. The contrast between Edgar's birth family and his new environment extended beyond material circumstances to cultural and social values. The theatrical world of his parents, with its emphasis on emotion, imagination, and artistic expression, differed markedly from the mercantile values of the Allan household, where practical achievement, social respectability, and financial acumen were prized. This dichotomy between artistic sensibility and practical concerns would become a central tension in Edgar's life and work, manifesting in his literature as conflicts between imagination and reality, between aesthetic ideals and material necessities. As 1815 approached, John Allan's business interests were expanding to include international trade with Britain. The end of the War of 1812 opened new opportunities for transatlantic commerce, and Allan began making plans to establish a branch of his firm in London. This development would soon lead to another major transition in young Edgar's life, as the Allan family prepared to relocate temporarily to England. For the 5-year-old boy who had already experienced so much disruption and loss, another journey and another adaptation to a new environment lay ahead. This time across an ocean, to a country and culture far removed from the only home he could remember. In June 1815, 6-year-old Edgar Poe embarked on a journey that would dramatically expand his horizons and shape his intellectual development. Accompanying John and Frances Allan aboard the sailing ship Lothair, he left behind the familiar landscapes of Virginia for the unknown territories of England. The transatlantic voyage itself was a significant experience for a child who had rarely ventured beyond Richmond. The journey took approximately 4 weeks, a relatively swift crossing for the era, but still long enough to impress upon young Edgar the vastness of the ocean and the profound separation from everything he had known. The Allans' decision to bring Edgar with them to England, rather than leaving him in the care of friends or relatives in Richmond, suggests the depth of Frances Allan's attachment to the boy and perhaps John Allan's growing acceptance of his role as Edgar's guardian. For Edgar, the journey represented yet another major transition in a life already marked by disruption and change. Yet unlike the earlier transitions of his infancy and toddlerhood, this one occurred at an age when he was fully conscious of the experience and capable of forming lasting memories and impressions. Upon arrival in Liverpool, the family made their way to London, where John Allan expected to stay for several years to develop new business for his general merchant and tobacco trading firm, Ellis and Allan. The London they encountered in the summer of 1815 was a city transformed by recent events. Just days before their arrival, the Battle of Waterloo had ended the Napoleonic Wars, and the city was still celebrating this momentous victory. London, in 1815, was the largest city in the world, with a population exceeding 1 million inhabitants, a stark contrast to Richmond's modest 10,000. For young Edgar, the scale, noise, and energy of the metropolis must have been both overwhelming and exhilarating. The Allans settled in a comfortable home at 47 Southampton Row, Russell Square, in the Bloomsbury district of London. This area, developed in the late 18th century, was characterized by elegant Georgian townhouses arranged around garden squares. It was a respectable neighborhood populated largely by professional and merchant families of the middle and upper middle classes. The Allan household, as befitted John Allan's status as a merchant, included several servants who would have assisted in the daily operations of the home and the care of young Edgar. In 1816, Edgar entered the boarding school of the Misses Dubourg in Sloane Street, Chelsea. This marked the beginning of his formal education. The school, run by the sisters Catherine and Jane Dubourg, provided instruction in the basic elements of reading, writing, arithmetic, and proper deportment expected of young gentlemen. For Edgar, who had likely received some rudimentary education in the Allan home, this represented an introduction to the structured learning environment that would characterize much of his childhood in England. The transition to school life brought new challenges and opportunities for the young boy. Separated from Francis Allan's nurturing presence during school hours, he had to navigate relationships with teachers and fellow students on his own. The Dubourg School, while not especially rigorous by the standards of elite English education, nevertheless introduced Edgar to a more formal academic discipline than he had previously experienced. It was here that his facility with language likely began to manifest itself, laying the groundwork for his later literary achievements. During 1817, Edgar continued his education in England, showing early aptitude for languages. The curriculum at the Dubourg School would have expanded to include elements of Latin, French, and perhaps Greek, subjects considered essential for a proper gentleman's education in early 19th century England. Edgar's natural linguistic abilities allowed him to absorb these languages with relative ease, developing skills that would later influence his literary style and his occasional use of foreign phrases and references in his writing. This period also saw Edgar's first sustained exposure to English literature and culture. The Romantic movement was at its height, with poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, and Shelley producing works that challenged conventional forms and celebrated imagination, emotion, and the sublime in nature. While Edgar was too young to directly engage with these contemporary literary developments, the cultural atmosphere of England during this period, with its Gothic sensibilities, its fascination with the medieval past, and its exploration of the boundaries between reason and emotion, would leave lasting impressions that would later emerge in his own literary work. In 1818, Edgar's education took a significant step forward when he was enrolled at the Manor House School in Stoke Newington, a London suburb, under the headmaster Reverend John Bransby. This was a more substantial educational institution than the Dubourg School, with a broader curriculum and higher expectations. The Manor House School occupied an impressive Queen Anne-era building dating from the early 18th century, surrounded by extensive grounds that included gardens, playing fields, and ancient trees. The physical environment of the school, with its historic architecture and secluded setting, would later feature in Poe's semi-autobiographical story William Wilson, where he described it as a dreamlike and spirit-soothing place. Reverend Bransby, whom Poe would also memorialize in William Wilson, was a formidable figure, a clergyman of the Church of England who combined religious instruction with classical education. Under his direction, the school provided a rigorous curriculum centered on classical languages and literature, mathematics, history, and religious studies. The pedagogical approach emphasized memorization, recitation, and strict discipline, with corporal punishment a common response to infractions of the school's many rules. From 1818 to 1820, Edgar immersed himself in this educational environment. At Manor House School, he studied Latin, French, mathematics, history, and literature, developing a strong foundation in classical education that would inform his later writing. The school day typically began early, with students rising before dawn in winter months, and included long hours of study interspersed with periods for meals, exercise, and religious observance. Students slept in dormitories and had little privacy or personal freedom. A common experience in English boarding schools of the period, but one that may have been particularly challenging for a boy already familiar with disruption and loss. Despite these challenges, Edgar appears to have thrived academically at Manor House. His facility with languages continued to develop, and he likely began to show the literary interests and abilities that would define his later life. The classical education he received, with its emphasis on rhetoric, meter, and literary forms, provided technical foundations for his future poetry and prose. His exposure to Latin and Greek literature introduced him to themes and motifs: the underworld, the return of the dead, the power of fate, that would recur throughout his mature work. The social environment of an English boarding school also shaped Edgar's developing personality and interpersonal skills. As an American boy in an English school, he would have been marked as different by his accent and mannerisms. This experience of otherness, combined with his already complex sense of identity as a child being raised by guardians rather than biological parents, likely contributed to the themes of alienation and divided self that would later characterize his writing. At the same time, the need to navigate this environment would have developed his social adaptability and his keen observation of human behavior. While Edgar was receiving this formal education, the Allan family's circumstances were changing. By 1819, John Allan's business in London had begun to struggle financially. The post-war economic climate in Britain was challenging, with high unemployment, social unrest, and financial instability. The tobacco trade, which formed a significant part of Allan's business, was particularly affected by changing market conditions and increased competition. These business difficulties created financial strain for the family and likely tensions within the household that even a young Edgar would have perceived. Francis Allan's health also began to deteriorate during this period, adding another layer of concern and instability to Edgar's life. While the specific nature of her health problems is not well documented, they were serious enough to cause worry and to contribute to the family's eventual decision to return to America. For Edgar, who had formed a strong attachment to Francis as a maternal figure, her illness would have revived fears of loss and abandonment stemming from his earliest experiences. By 1820, the combination of business failures and health concerns made the Allans' position in London untenable. John Allan made the difficult decision to close his London operation and return to Richmond, where he hoped to rebuild his business and where Frances might recover her health in a familiar environment. For Edgar, now 11 years old and having spent 5 formative years in England, this meant another major transition and the loss of the educational and social context to which he had adapted. In the summer of 1820, the Allan family boarded the sailing ship Martha and began their journey back to Richmond, Virginia. The return voyage, like their outward journey 5 years earlier, took approximately a month. For Edgar, the sea crossing represented not just a physical journey, but a psychological one. Leaving behind the structured environment of his English education and returning to a Richmond that was both familiar and strange after his years abroad. The boy who returned to America was significantly different from the 6-year-old who had left. His English education had given him a strong academic foundation, particularly in languages and literature. His experiences in London had exposed him to a wider world of culture, history, and social complexity than he would have encountered in Richmond. And his navigation of the challenges of boarding school life had developed his independence and his capacity for acute observation of his surroundings and the people who inhabited them. These years in England, while representing just a brief period in Poe's life, had lasting effects on his intellectual development and artistic sensibility. The Gothic atmosphere of ancient buildings, the rhythms and structures of classical education, the experience of being an outsider in a foreign culture, all these elements would later find expression in his literary work. Most significantly, perhaps, his English education gave him access to a literary tradition and a set of cultural references that would distinguish his writing from that of his American contemporaries, contributing to the unique voice that would eventually establish him as one of America's most distinctive and influential writers. The Martha docked in New York Harbor in July 1820, bringing 11-year-old Edgar Poe back to American soil after 5 formative years in England. The America to which he returned was a nation transformed. In his absence, the country had expanded westward with the admission of 5 new states to the Union. had weathered the economic panic of 1819 and had begun to develop a more distinctive national identity in the aftermath of the War of 1812. For Edgar, however, the most significant change awaited him in Richmond, where the Allan family would attempt to rebuild their lives after their disappointing London sojourn. The journey from New York to Richmond took the Allans through Philadelphia and Baltimore, cities that would later play significant roles in Edgar's adult life. The overland travel, accomplished by a combination of coastal vessels and stagecoaches, provided Edgar with his first glimpses of the American landscape beyond Virginia. The bustling port of New York, the ordered streets of Philadelphia, the hills and forests of the mid-Atlantic region. After the density and antiquity of London, the relative newness and openness of American cities and countryside must have struck him forcefully, reinforcing his sense of having moved between distinctly different worlds. Upon their return to Richmond in August 1820, the Allans found themselves in reduced circumstances. John Allan's business failures in London had depleted much of his capital, and he faced the challenge of re-establishing himself in the Richmond business community. The family initially took lodgings at the boarding house of Mrs. Mary Mackenzie on Tobacco Alley, a significant step down from their previous Richmond home and their comfortable London residence. This change in fortune created new tensions within the household as John Allan struggled to maintain appearances while rebuilding his finances. For Edgar, the return to Richmond meant reconnecting with his sister Rosalie, now 8 years old and being raised by the Mackenzie family. Though they had been separated since infancy and had developed in very different environments, the siblings established a relationship that would endure with varying degrees of closeness throughout their lives. Rosalie, described by contemporaries as sweet-natured but somewhat simple, provided Edgar with one of his few blood connections in a life otherwise defined by tenuous adoptive relationships. In late 1820, Edgar was enrolled at the school of Joseph H. Clark, a Trinity College Dublin graduate who had established an academy for boys in Richmond. Clark's school, located on the corner of 5th and Carey Streets, provided a classical education similar in many respects to what Edgar had received at Manor House School in England. The curriculum emphasized Latin, Greek, mathematics, and English composition, subjects in which Edgar, thanks to his English education, was already well grounded. Clark quickly recognized Edgar's intellectual abilities, particularly his facility with languages and his literary aptitude. In later recollections, Clark described young Poe as a swift learner with a poetic temperament who excelled in Latin and French and showed early promise in verse composition. Under Clark's tutelage, Edgar continued to develop the classical foundations that would later inform his literary work, with its allusions to ancient mythology, its structural precision, and its sophisticated use of rhetorical devices. The social dynamics of Clark's school presented new challenges for Edgar. As a boy who had spent his formative years in England, he likely retained traces of English accent and mannerisms that marked him as different from his Virginia-raised classmates. Moreover, his ambiguous social position, neither fully a member of the Allan family nor clearly identified with his birth parents, placed him in an uncertain relationship to Richmond's class-conscious society. These factors, combined with his intellectual precocity and artistic temperament, may have contributed to a sense of alienation that would later find expression in his literary explorations of outsider figures and divided identities. Despite these potential social complications, Edgar appears to have made some significant friendships during this period. His closest companion was Robert Stannard, a classmate whose mother, Jane Stith Stannard, would have a profound impact on Edgar's emotional development. Mrs. Stannard, described as beautiful, gracious, and kind, welcomed Edgar into her home and showed him the maternal warmth and understanding that he craved. His attachment to her became one of the defining emotional experiences of his adolescence. In 1823, when Edgar was 14, Jane Stannard began to show signs of mental illness. her condition deteriorated rapidly, leading to her death in April 1824. For Edgar, who had already experienced the loss of his birth mother and the precariousness of Francis Allan's health, Mrs. Stannard's decline and death represented another devastating blow. The impact of this loss would reverberate throughout his life and work, informing his literary preoccupation with the deaths of beautiful women and his idealization of maternal figures. Years later, he would tell a friend that his poem To Helen was inspired by Jane Stannard, whom he described as the first purely ideal love of my soul. Meanwhile, John Allan's business fortunes had begun to improve. By 1822, he had re-established his firm and moved the family to a more comfortable home at 5th and Main Streets. In 1825, they relocated again to an even more impressive residence at 8th and Main, reflecting Allan's renewed prosperity. This period also saw a significant change in Allan's personal circumstances when he inherited a substantial estate from his uncle William Galt, one of the wealthiest men in Richmond. This inheritance, estimated at $750,000, equivalent to many millions in today's currency, transformed Allan's financial situation and elevated his social standing in Richmond society. For Edgar, his guardian's newfound wealth brought material benefits, but also heightened the contradictions in their relationship. While he now lived in a fine home, attended an excellent school, and had access to books and cultural opportunities, he remained legally unacknowledged by Allan and subject to his guardian's increasingly unpredictable moods and judgments. The contrast between outward privilege and inner insecurity created psychological tensions that would influence Edgar's developing personality and his attitude toward issues of class, status, and authenticity. Edgar's education continued to advance during this period. In 1823, Joseph Clark closed his school, and Edgar transferred to the Academy of William Burke, another classical scholar who maintained the rigorous educational standards to which Edgar had become accustomed. Under Burke's guidance, Edgar continued to excel academically, particularly in literary subjects. He also began to develop his own creative voice, writing verses that impressed both his teachers and his classmates with their technical skill and emotional intensity. Outside the classroom, Edgar was developing physical as well as intellectual prowess. He became known for his athletic abilities, particularly in swimming. In June 1825, he performed a feat that became legendary in Richmond when he swam 6 miles against the current in the James River on a hot summer day. This demonstration of physical endurance and determination revealed a side of Edgar's character that contrasted with his literary sensibilities, but aligned with the romantic ideal of the poet as a figure of exceptional abilities in multiple domains. Edgar's adolescence also saw the emergence of his interest in military life and discipline. This interest may have been influenced by the martial atmosphere of his English boarding school, by the military history he studied in his classical education, or by a desire for the structure and clear hierarchies that military life promised. Whatever its origins, this fascination would later lead him to enlist in the United States Army, and would inform his brief, troubled tenure at West Point Military Academy. By 1826, as Edgar approached his 17th birthday, tensions between him and John Allan had begun to escalate. The sources of conflict were multiple and complex. Edgar's literary ambitions clashed with Allan's more practical values and expectations. The young man's romantic temperament and sensitivity contrasted with his guardian's hard-headed business orientation. And Edgar's growing awareness of his ambiguous position in the Allan household, particularly as John and Frances Allan began to entertain the possibility of having children of their own, created resentments and insecurities that found expression in increasingly rebellious behavior. Financial issues further complicated their relationship. Despite his substantial wealth, John Allan maintained tight control over Edgar's expenses and frequently criticized what he saw as the young man's extravagance and impracticality. Edgar, for his part, felt that Allan's financial support was both an obligation based on the commitments he had made in taking Edgar into his home and a poor substitute for the legal recognition and emotional acceptance he craved. These conflicts over money would persist throughout their relationship, contributing to the final breach that would occur in later years. Another source of tension emerged in Edgar's romantic life. As he matured into a handsome, intelligent young man with literary talents and social graces, he began to attract female attention. His most significant attachment during this period was to Sarah Elmira Royster, a 15-year-old girl from a respectable Richmond family. Their relationship, conducted largely through clandestine meetings and secret correspondence, represented Edgar's first serious romantic involvement and awakened emotional and physical desires that added new complications to his already complex adolescent development. The Royster family, like many in Richmond society, viewed Edgar with some ambivalence. While his connection to the now wealthy Allan family gave him social standing, his ambiguous legal status and his reputation for romantic intensity raised concerns about his suitability as a match for their daughter. These social dynamics, which Edgar would have perceived with his characteristic sensitivity to nuance and judgment, likely reinforced his sense of being an outsider even in the community where he had spent most of his life. As 1826 progressed, Edgar's thoughts turned increasingly toward higher education. The University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson, had opened its doors the previous year and represented the pinnacle of educational opportunity in the South. Edgar, with his strong academic background and literary ambitions, was well qualified for university studies and eager to continue his intellectual development in this new institution. John Allan, despite his frequent complaints about Edgar's behavior and attitudes, agreed to enroll him at the university for the following academic year, perhaps hoping that the structure and demands of higher education would channel his ward's energies in more productive directions. Edgar's preparations for university were accompanied by increasing friction with John Allan and growing uncertainty about his relationship with Elmira Royster. As he stood on the threshold of adulthood, the patterns of loss, ambivalence, and thwarted connection that had characterized his childhood and adolescence continued to shape his expectations and behavior. The privileged but precarious position he occupied in Richmond society, educated like a gentleman but without the secure family identity and financial independence that typically accompanied that status, created contradictions that he would spend much of his adult life attempting to resolve through his literary work and his often troubled personal relationships. On February 14, 1826, 17-year-old Edgar Allan Poe arrived at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, a journey of approximately 70 miles from Richmond. The university, founded by Thomas Jefferson and opened just the previous year, represented a bold educational experiment in the young American nation. Unlike the established colleges of the Northeast with their religious foundations and traditional curricula, Jefferson's university was designed as a secular institution dedicated to modern learning, with an innovative approach to education that allowed students to select their courses of study rather than following a prescribed program. The physical environment of the university made a strong impression on the aesthetically sensitive young Poe. Jefferson's architectural vision had created what he called an academical village, centered around a grand rotunda housing the library, with parallel rows of pavilions connected by colonnaded walkways. Each pavilion contained both classrooms and faculty residences, creating an integrated living and learning community. The neoclassical design, with its emphasis on harmony, proportion, and connection to ancient ideals of learning, provided a striking contrast to the more medieval atmosphere of Poe's English boarding school experience. Poe took lodgings in room 13 on the West Range, a Spartan chamber approximately 13 by 15 feet, furnished with a bed, a chair, a table, and a washstand. These modest accommodations were typical for students of the period and reflected Jefferson's belief that simple living conditions promoted intellectual focus. For Poe, Accustomed to the relative comfort of the Allan household in Richmond, the plainness of his university quarters may have represented both a challenge and a kind of freedom. His first experience of independent living, away from John Allan's direct supervision and judgment. The university's student body in 1826 consisted of approximately 177 young men, primarily from wealthy southern families. Many brought with them the habits and expectations of the plantation aristocracy, a taste for fine clothes, good food and wine, gambling, and other gentlemanly pursuits. The university had no specific regulations regarding student conduct beyond Jefferson's idealistic expectation that young gentlemen would behave honorably without external constraints. This laissez-faire approach, combined with the youth and privilege of the student population, created an environment where academic pursuits often took second place to social activities and where discipline problems were common. Poe enrolled in the School of Ancient Languages, studying Latin and Greek under Professor George Long, and in the School of Modern Languages, where he studied French, Italian, and Spanish under Professor George Bletterman. His choice of subjects reflected both his existing linguistic strengths, developed during his education in England and Richmond, and his literary interests. The university's approach allowed students to progress at their own pace, and Poe's facility with languages enabled him to advance rapidly in his studies. Academically, Poe distinguished himself immediately. Professor Long later recalled him as a successful student, having obtained distinctions in Latin and French at the public examinations. His performance in these subjects reflected not only his intellectual abilities, but also his genuine passion for language and literature. While many of his fellow students viewed their studies as an obligatory prelude to careers in law, medicine, or plantation management, Poe approached his coursework with the dedication of someone who saw literature and language as central to his identity and future aspirations. Outside the classroom, Poe's university experience was more complicated. His ambiguous social position, connected to the wealthy Allan family but not legally adopted, and with his own family background in the less socially prestigious world of theatre, created challenges in the status-conscious environment of the university. His English education had given him a different accent and frame of reference from many of his Virginia-raised classmates, and his serious interest in poetry and literature set him apart in a culture that valued social graces and physical prowess over intellectual or artistic achievements. Despite these potential barriers, Poe appears to have developed a social life at the university, forming friendships with several classmates, including Thomas Good Tucker and Philip St. George Ambler. These relationships provided companionship and a sense of belonging, but they also exposed Poe to the gambling culture that was prevalent among the students. Card games, particularly Loo and 7-Up, were popular pastimes, often accompanied by drinking and wagering that could lead students into significant debt. For Poe, with his complex relationship to money and his desire for acceptance among his peers, this environment proved particularly hazardous. As the academic year progressed, Poe began to accumulate gambling debts that far exceeded his limited means. John Allan had provided him with an allowance that, while adequate for basic expenses, was insufficient for the lifestyle maintained by many of his wealthier classmates. Poe's letters to Allan requesting additional funds became increasingly frequent and desperate, reflecting both his growing financial difficulties and his belief that Allan, with his recently inherited wealth, could and should be more generous in his support. Allan's responses were unsympathetic. He viewed Poe's financial problems as evidence of irresponsibility and ingratitude, reinforcing his existing concerns about his ward's character and judgment. The correspondence between them during this period reveals the deepening rift in their relationship, Poe alternating between appeals for understanding and expressions of resentment, Allan between stern admonitions and outright refusals. This conflict over money reflected deeper issues of identity, obligation, and emotional connection that had long simmered beneath the surface of their relationship. By December 1826, Poe's gambling debts had reached approximately $2,500, an enormous sum for the time, equivalent to several years' income for many Americans. Faced with these debts of honor that he could not pay, and increasingly alienated from John Allan, Poe found himself in a position of acute social and financial distress. His academic success offered little consolation in the face of these practical problems, and the contrast between his intellectual achievements and his personal difficulties likely contributed to the sense of divided self that would later characterize much of his writing. During this period of mounting crisis, Poe continued to develop his literary voice. He wrote poetry that circulated among his friends and classmates, earning a reputation for his verbal facility and emotional intensity. These early verses, while not preserved in their original form, likely reflected the influences of the British Romantic poets, particularly Byron, whose combination of romantic melancholy, sardonic wit, and personal rebellion would have resonated with Poe's own temperament and circumstances. The university environment, despite its challenges, provided Poe with the intellectual stimulation and the audience of educated peers that nurtured his developing literary ambitions. In addition to his formal studies and his creative writing, Poe immersed himself in the literary culture available to him at the university. Jefferson's vision had placed the library at the physical and intellectual center of the institution, housing a carefully selected collection of books that reflected his belief in the importance of wide-ranging knowledge. Poe took full advantage of these resources, reading extensively in multiple languages and across various genres: poetry, fiction, philosophy, history, and science. This broad reading would later inform the encyclopedic range of references and allusions in his mature work. The university's debating society provided another outlet for Poe's intellectual energies and his growing interest in rhetoric and argumentation. These formal debates, covering topics from politics and history to literature and philosophy, allowed him to develop the analytical precision and logical rigor that would later characterize his literary criticism and his pioneering work in detective fiction. They also gave him experience in public speaking and in crafting persuasive arguments, skills that would serve him well in his later career as an editor and literary figure. As the academic year drew to a close in December 1826, Poe faced a critical juncture. Despite his academic success, his financial situation had become untenable, and his relationship with John Allan had deteriorated to the point where continued support for his education seemed unlikely. The contrast between his intellectual promise and his practical circumstances created a painful dilemma: whether to abandon his education and the social status it represented, or to seek some alternative means of supporting himself and continuing his studies. In the end, the decision was made for him. When Poe returned to Richmond for the winter break, the confrontation with John Allan that had been building throughout the year finally erupted. Allan refused to pay Poe's gambling debts or to provide funds for his return to the university. The specific details of their argument are not recorded, but the outcome was clear. Poe's university career was over after just 1 year, and his relationship with Allan had reached a breaking point that would never be fully repaired. This abrupt end to his formal education represented a significant setback for Poe, cutting short his intellectual development within an institutional framework and closing off the professional opportunities that a university degree would have provided. However, it also forced him toward greater independence and self-reliance, accelerating his need to establish his own identity separate from the Allan family and to find a way to support himself through his own efforts and abilities. The months following his departure from the university were difficult ones for Poe. He remained in Richmond, living in the Allan household but increasingly estranged from John Allan. His relationship with Frances Allan provided some emotional support, but her declining health limited her ability to mediate between her husband and her foster son. Poe's social position in Richmond had become awkward. No longer a university student, not yet established in any profession, and with his connection to the Allan family increasingly tenuous. During this period, Poe turned more intensely to writing as both an emotional outlet and a potential path to independence. In March 1827, he published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, under the pseudonym A Bostonian. The slim volume, printed by Calvin F. S. Thomas in Boston, contained the title Poem, a lengthy work influenced by Byron's narrative style and 9 shorter pieces. The publication was financed by Poe himself, likely using funds borrowed from friends, and reflected his determination to establish himself as a poet despite the obstacles he faced. Tamerlane tells the story of a conqueror who sacrifices love for ambition, only to regret his choice in old age, a theme that resonates with Poe's own experience of loss and his ambivalent relationship to ambition and success. The poem, while showing the influence of Byron and other Romantic poets, also displays elements that would become characteristic of Poe's mature work: a preoccupation with death and loss, a fascination with the exotic and the distant past, and an intense focus on emotional states and psychological extremes. The publication of Tamerlane marked an important milestone in Poe's development as a writer, representing his first attempt to reach a public audience beyond his immediate circle of friends and acquaintances. However, the book attracted little attention and no reviews, disappearing almost without trace into the literary marketplace. Only 50 copies were printed, and today fewer than a dozen are known to exist, making it one of the rarest first editions in American literature. This commercial failure, while disappointing, did not deter Poe from his literary ambitions, but may have contributed to his growing realization that poetry alone was unlikely to provide him with financial independence. As 1827 progressed, the tensions between Poe and John Allan continued to escalate. Their fundamental incompatibility of temperament and values, long managed through Francis Allan's mediation and the structures of school and university, had become impossible to ignore or accommodate. For Allan, Poe represented a disappointing investment. A young man who had received advantages of education and social position but had failed to develop the practical skills and attitudes necessary for success in business or the professions. For Poe, Allan embodied the materialistic values and emotional coldness that he was increasingly defining himself against, both personally and artistically. The final break came in March 1827, when, after a particularly heated argument with Allan, Poe left the Allan household, determined to make his own way in the world. At 18 years old, with minimal financial resources, no family connections to draw upon, and no professional training beyond his incomplete university education, he faced daunting challenges. His decision to leave represented both an act of desperation and a declaration of independence, a rejection of the conditional acceptance and financial dependence that had characterized his relationship with Allan in favor of an uncertain but autonomous future. Poe's immediate plan was to return to his birthplace, Boston, perhaps hoping to connect with his maternal relatives or to find opportunities in the city's more developed literary culture. However, the practical realities of supporting himself quickly asserted themselves. With his literary ambitions unlikely to provide immediate income, and with few marketable skills beyond his education and intelligence, Poe made a decision that would shape the next phase of his life. On May 26, 1827, he enlisted in the United States Army under the name Edgar A. Perry, claiming to be 22 years old, 4 years older than his actual age. This decision to Poe was assigned to Battery H of the 1st Artillery, stationed at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor. As a well-educated and physically fit young man, he quickly distinguished himself, rising to the rank of Sergeant Major, the highest non-commissioned rank, in just 2 years. His military duties, while demanding, left him time for reading and writing, allowing him to continue developing his literary skills, even as he adapted to the rigors and routines of army life. This period of military service, while representing a detour from his literary ambitions, provided Poe with experiences and observations that would later inform works like The Gold Bug and The Man Who Was Used Up. The year 1827 thus marked a critical transition in Poe's life, from student to soldier, from dependent ward to independent adult, from aspiring poet to published author. The abrupt end of his university career and his break with the Allan family forced him to confront harsh realities about his position in society and his prospects for the future. Yet these setbacks also freed him from constraints and expectations that had limited his self-expression and self-determination. As he adapted to his new circumstances in the army, Poe began the process of reinventing himself, a process that would continue with various transformations and setbacks throughout his turbulent life. Edgar Allan Poe's enlistment in the United States Army under the assumed name Edgar A. Perry on May 26, 1827, marked a dramatic shift in his life trajectory. Assigned to Battery H of the 1st Artillery at Fort Independence, located on Castle Island in Boston Harbor, the 18-year-old found himself immersed in a world vastly different from the academic halls of the University of Virginia or the genteel society of Richmond. Fort Independence, the moustache-shaped granite fortification dating back to the early 17th century, served as a key coastal defense installation. Life within its walls was governed by the strict routines, hierarchical structures, and communal living conditions of military service. For Poe, the transition to army life presented both challenges and opportunities. The physical demands of artillery training, handling heavy cannons, marching, drilling, required a discipline and endurance that contrasted with his previous scholarly pursuits. The social environment, dominated by enlisted men from diverse backgrounds, many with limited education, differed markedly from the privileged circles he had known. Yet Poe adapted remarkably well to these new circumstances. His intelligence, education, and inherent discipline allowed him to master his duties quickly and efficiently. His superiors recognized his abilities. Within months of enlistment, he was appointed company clerk, a position that utilized his literacy and organizational skills. By January 1, 1829, he had achieved the rank of Sergeant Major for artillery, the highest non-commissioned rank in the Army. This rapid promotion attested to his competence, reliability, and perhaps his ability to command respect even within the unfamiliar context of military hierarchy. As Sergeant Major, he was responsible for administrative tasks, maintaining records, and assisting commissioned officers. Duties that required precision and attention to detail, qualities Poe possessed in abundance. During his service at Fort Independence, Poe continued to pursue his literary interests in his limited free time. The structured routine of military life, while demanding, may have provided a framework that allowed him to focus his creative energies more effectively than the chaotic freedom of his university days. He read voraciously, borrowing books from the post library and perhaps from sympathetic officers. He also continued to write poetry, honing the technical skills and exploring the themes that would characterize his mature work. The dramatic setting of Fort Independence, a stone fortress surrounded by the sea, subject to the changing moods of weather and tide, may have provided inspiration for the atmospheric settings and themes of confinement and isolation that would later feature prominently in his tales. In November 1828, Poe's unit was transferred from Fort Independence to Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, near Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Moultrie, another historic coastal fortification famous for its role in the Revolutionary War, offered a different environment. A subtropical climate, a landscape of sand dunes and palmetto trees, and proximity to the vibrant, complex society of Charleston. This change of scenery exposed Poe to the distinctive culture and atmosphere of the Deep South, providing new experiences and observations that would later find their way into his writing. Most notably in the setting and local color of his story, The Gold Bug. Despite his success in the army, Poe soon grew dissatisfied with military life. While he had proven his competence and earned promotions, the constraints of enlisted service chafed against his intellectual ambitions and his desire for a literary career. The prospect of spending years fulfilling his 5-year enlistment term seemed increasingly unbearable. By late 1828, he began exploring ways to secure an early discharge. His strategy involved revealing his true identity and circumstances to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Howard. Poe explained that he had enlisted under an assumed name due to personal difficulties and expressed his desire to leave the army to pursue other opportunities, possibly including an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Lieutenant Howard, impressed by Poe's character and abilities, proved sympathetic. He agreed to support Poe's request for discharge on the condition that Poe reconcile with his guardian, John Allan, and obtain Allan's formal consent. This condition placed Poe in a difficult position. His relationship with Allan had remained fractured since their confrontation in early 1827. Reaching out to Allan required swallowing his pride and reopening communication with the man who represented both his past security and his present alienation. In December 1828, Poe wrote to Allan from Fort Moultrie, explaining his situation, expressing regret for past conflicts, and requesting Allan's assistance in securing his discharge. The letter reflects Poe's desperation and his willingness to humble himself in pursuit of freedom from his enlistment commitment. Allan's initial response was non-committal. He was preoccupied with his own affairs, particularly the declining health of his wife, Frances. Frances Allan had been suffering from a lingering illness, likely tuberculosis, for several years. Her condition worsened significantly in early 1829. Poe, learning of her critical state, felt a desperate need to see the woman who had been the closest figure to a mother he had known since infancy. He requested leave from Fort Moultrie to travel to Richmond, but military bureaucracy moved slowly. By the time his leave was granted and he arrived in Richmond on February 28, 1829, Frances Allan had already died and been buried the previous day. The death of Frances Allan was a profound blow to Poe. It severed his last significant emotional tie to the Allan household and removed the one person who had consistently offered him affection and understanding within that family. Her death also occurred at a moment when Poe was seeking reconciliation with John Allan, making his position even more precarious. He attended her funeral services, grieving not only for Frances, but perhaps also for the lost possibility of a stable family connection that her presence had represented. In the aftermath of Frances's death, John Allan seemed temporarily softened toward Poe. Perhaps moved by shared grief or influenced by Frances's known affection for her foster son, Allan agreed to help secure Poe's discharge from the army. He provided the necessary written consent and may have used his influence to expedite the process. On April 15, 1829, Edgar Allan Poe was honorably discharged from the United States Army, having served 2 years of his 5-year enlistment. His discharge certificate noted his character as good and his service as faithful, confirming his successful adaptation to military life. However, freedom from the army did not immediately resolve Poe's practical difficulties. He was still without financial resources or clear professional prospects. He spent several months in Baltimore, living with his paternal relatives, including his widowed aunt Maria Clem, his father's sister, and her young daughter Virginia Eliza Clem. He also reconnected with his older brother, William Henry Leonard Poe, who was living in Baltimore and attempting, with limited success, to establish himself as a writer. During this period in Baltimore, Poe continued his literary efforts. He revised poems from his first collection and wrote new ones, preparing a second volume for publication. In December 1829, the Baltimore publishing firm Hatch and Dunning released Al-Araf, Tamerlane and Minor Poems. This collection included a revised version of Tamerlane, the ambitious but obscure cosmological poem Al-Araf, and several shorter lyrics, including early versions of poems like To Science and Romance. Like his first book, Al-Araf attracted little critical attention and failed to generate significant income, reinforcing the challenges Poe faced in pursuing a literary career. While living in Baltimore, Poe also pursued the possibility of securing an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. This ambition represented a complex mix of motivations. West Point offered a path to a respectable career as an Army officer, potentially satisfying John Allan's desire for Poe to pursue a practical profession. It also appealed to Poe's interest in military structure and discipline, and perhaps offered a way to achieve the social standing and financial security that had eluded him. With Allan's reluctant support, likely influenced by a desire to see Poe settled in a structured environment, Poe obtained the necessary recommendations and secured an appointment to the Academy. Before entering West Point, Poe experienced further changes in his relationship with the Allan family. In October 1830, John Allan remarried, taking as his second wife Louisa Patterson, a woman considerably younger than himself and from a prominent New York family. This marriage effectively ended any lingering possibility of Poe inheriting Allan's estate or regaining a central place in his guardian's life. Allan's focus shifted to his new wife and the possibility of having biological heirs, further marginalizing Poe's position. On July 1, 1830, Edgar Allan Poe entered West Point as a cadet. The academy, located on a scenic bluff overlooking the Hudson River, provided rigorous training in engineering, mathematics, military science, and discipline. The life of a cadet was demanding, with strict regulations governing every aspect of daily routine, from dress and deportment to study habits and social interactions. For Poe, who had already experienced military life as an enlisted man, the transition to the more elite and academically focused environment of West Point presented new challenges and opportunities. Initially, Poe seemed to adapt well to cadet life. His previous military experience gave him an advantage in drills and discipline, while his strong academic background allowed him to excel in his coursework, particularly in French and mathematics. He continued to write poetry, sharing his work with fellow cadets and earning a reputation for his literary talents. Some accounts suggest he was popular among his peers, known for his wit, his storytelling abilities, and his occasional acts of rebellion against the Academy's strict rules. However, the underlying tensions in Poe's life soon resurfaced. His relationship with John Allan remained strained, with Allan providing minimal financial support and expressing continued disapproval of Poe's choices. Poe's letters to Allan during this period reveal his ongoing financial struggles and his frustration with his guardian's perceived indifference. Without adequate funds, Poe found it difficult to maintain the expected standard of living for a cadet, contributing to feelings of alienation and resentment. More fundamentally, Poe began to question his commitment to a military career. The rigid discipline and practical focus of West Point clashed with his artistic temperament and literary ambitions. The prospect of spending his life as an army officer seemed increasingly incompatible with his desire for creative expression and intellectual freedom. As his disillusionment grew, his performance at the academy began to suffer. He started neglecting his duties, accumulating demerits for minor infractions, and showing signs of the rebellious behavior that had characterized his final months at the University of Virginia. By early 1831, Poe had made the deliberate decision to seek dismissal from West Point. Lacking the funds to resign honorably, he chose a path of passive resistance, intentionally violating regulations in ways that would lead to court-martial and expulsion. he accumulated numerous demerits for offences such as neglecting drills, missing classes, and disobeying orders. His actions were calculated to force the Academy's hand, securing his release from an environment where he no longer felt he belonged. On January 28, 1831, Poe was tried by court-martial on charges of gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. He pleaded guilty to the charges, effectively ensuring his dismissal. On February 8, 1831, he was formally expelled from West Point. His departure marked the end of his brief, tumultuous engagement with military life and closed off another potential path to conventional success and stability. Before leaving West Point, Poe secured funding from his fellow cadets, who admired his poetry even if they were perplexed by his behavior, to publish a third volume of poems. This collection, simply titled Poems by Edgar A. Poe, 2nd edition, though it contained mostly new material, was published in New York by Elam Bliss in April 1831. It included revised versions of earlier poems, along with significant new works like To Helen, Israfel, and The Doomed City, an early version of The City in the Sea. This volume represented a significant step forward in Poe's artistic development, showcasing his maturing voice, his technical mastery, and his distinctive thematic concerns. The publication of poems marked the end of Poe's formative years and the beginning of his full commitment to a literary career. Expelled from West Point, permanently estranged from John Allan, and with few prospects for conventional employment, Poe now faced the challenge of supporting himself solely through his writing. The path ahead would be fraught with financial hardship, personal turmoil, and critical misunderstanding. But it would also lead him to create some of the most enduring and influential works in American literature. Following his dismissal from West Point in February 1831, Edgar Allan Poe faced perhaps the most uncertain period of his already tumultuous life. At 22 years old, he had exhausted conventional paths to security and respectability. His relationship with John Allan was irreparably damaged, eliminating any hope of financial support or inheritance from that quarter. His military career had ended in disgrace, closing off possibilities in that profession. And his 3 published volumes of poetry, while demonstrating his developing literary talent, had failed to generate either significant critical attention or financial reward. With few options available, Poe made his way to Baltimore in the spring of 1831. The city held multiple attractions for him. It was the home of his remaining blood relatives, including his aunt Maria Clem and her daughter Virginia. His brother William Henry Leonard Poe resided there, and Baltimore possessed a more developed literary culture than many American cities of the period, offering potential opportunities for a young writer seeking to establish himself. Poe took lodgings with his Aunt Maria at her modest home on Wilk Street, later Eastern Avenue, in a working-class neighborhood of East Baltimore. Maria Clem's household represented a stark contrast to the affluence Poe had known in the Allan home. Maria, widowed in 1826, supported herself and her daughter through sewing, taking in boarders, and receiving occasional assistance from relatives. The family lived in genteel poverty, maintaining standards of education and refinement despite their limited resources. For Poe, joining this household meant accepting a significant reduction in material comfort, but it also provided him with something he had rarely experienced: unconditional acceptance from blood relatives who valued his literary ambitions and offered emotional support without judgment or expectation. The Baltimore of the early 1830s was a city of approximately 80,000 inhabitants, the second largest in the United States at that time. Its busy port, diverse population, and growing industrial base created a dynamic urban environment. The city had a vibrant cultural life, with theaters, lecture halls, and literary societies catering to various tastes and social classes. It also had a darker side, with poverty, disease, and social tensions affecting many of its residents. This complex urban landscape provided Poe with rich material for observation and reflection, influencing his developing literary sensibility and his understanding of human nature in all its variety. During his early months in Baltimore, Poe struggled to establish himself as a writer. He submitted poems and stories to various magazines and newspapers, facing frequent rejection and minimal compensation when his work was accepted. The American literary marketplace of the 1830s offered limited opportunities for professional writers. Copyright laws were weak or non-existent, allowing publishers to reprint foreign works without payment and reducing demand for original American literature. Few magazines paid their contributors adequately, and those that did often favored established names over unknown talents. In this challenging environment, Poe's lack of connections and his unconventional literary style further complicated his efforts to gain recognition and financial stability. Despite these obstacles, Poe persevered in his literary endeavors. He continued to refine his poetry, developing the musical qualities and emotional intensity that would become hallmarks of his verse. More significantly, he began to focus more attention on prose fiction, recognizing that stories might offer better prospects for publication and payment than poetry. During this period, he experimented with various narrative forms and themes, developing the distinctive voice and approach that would eventually revolutionize American short fiction. In October 1831, Poe suffered a personal loss when his older brother, William Henry Leonard Poe, died at the age of 24. The brothers had reconnected during Edgar's time in Baltimore, sharing literary interests and perhaps finding in each other a sense of family connection that both had largely lacked. William Henry had published a few poems and stories, suggesting a shared creative temperament, but his life had been marked by illness, possibly alcoholism, and unfulfilled potential. His early death reinforced themes of loss and mortality that already pervaded Edgar's consciousness and would continue to shape his literary work. The year 1833 brought a significant opportunity when the Baltimore Saturday Visitor announced a literary contest offering prizes for the best prose story and the best poem. Poe submitted multiple works, including the poem The Colosseum, and several stories collected under the title Tales of the Folio Club. The judges, including novelist John Pendleton Kennedy, awarded Poe the $50 prize for his story MS Found in a Bottle, a tale of supernatural horror set at sea. They also praised The Colosseum, noting that it would have won the poetry prize had they not realized both entries were by the same author. This recognition represented a crucial breakthrough in Poe's literary career. Beyond the financial reward, substantial for Poe at that time, the contest brought him to the attention of John Pendleton Kennedy, an established author and influential figure in Baltimore's literary circles. Kennedy took an interest in the struggling young writer, inviting him to dinner, lending him money, and eventually helping him secure publication opportunities. This patronage provided Poe with both practical assistance and valuable social connections at a critical juncture in his development. With Kennedy's support, Poe began to place his stories in various publications. In 1834, the Southern Literary Messenger, a new magazine based in Richmond, published his tale Berenice, a disturbing story of obsession and mental deterioration. This publication marked the beginning of Poe's relationship with the Messenger, which would soon offer him his first steady employment as a literary professional. Berenice, with its exploration of psychological extremes and its gothic atmosphere, exemplified the direction Poe's fiction was taking, away from the more conventional romantic tales of his earliest efforts toward the psychological depth and horror that would distinguish his mature work. During this period in Baltimore, Poe's relationship with his young cousin, Virginia Clem, began to evolve from familial affection to romantic attachment. Virginia, born in 1822, was only 7 years old when Poe first came to live with the Clem family. By 1834, she had grown into a beautiful, gentle girl of 12, described as having dark hair, violet eyes, and a pale complexion. Poe, then 25, found in Virginia qualities that appealed deeply to him: innocence, devotion, and perhaps a malleability that contrasted with the more independent women he had previously pursued. Their relationship developed gradually, with Poe assuming the role of teacher and protector before romantic feelings emerged. The nature of Poe's attachment to Virginia has been the subject of much speculation and controversy. By modern standards, the age difference and family relationship would make such a connection inappropriate. However, in the context of the early 19th century, marriages between cousins were common and socially acceptable, and girls often married in their early teens, particularly in circumstances of economic necessity. For the Clem family, Poe's interest in Virginia offered the possibility of financial security and social stability. For Poe, Virginia represented an ideal of feminine purity and devotion, as well as the opportunity to create the stable family life he had never experienced. In August 1835, Poe received an offer that would change the course of his life. Thomas Willis White, publisher of the Southern Literary Messenger, invited him to join the magazine as a staff writer and critic. This position offered a regular salary of $10 per week, modest but sufficient for basic needs, and the opportunity to develop his skills as an editor and critic while continuing to publish his own creative work. Poe accepted the offer eagerly, seeing it as a chance to establish himself professionally and to provide for Maria and Virginia Clem, who had become his surrogate family. Before leaving for Richmond, Poe took steps to formalize his relationship with Virginia. On September 22, 1835, he obtained a marriage license in Baltimore, though the actual marriage ceremony would not take place until the following year. This arrangement reflected both Poe's commitment to Virginia and his desire to ensure that she and her mother could join him in Richmond once he had established himself at the Messenger. The license listed Virginia's age as 21, a significant exaggeration of her actual age of 13, suggesting awareness that their relationship might raise eyebrows even in a society more accepting of young brides than our own. Poe's departure for Richmond in late September 1835 marked the end of his formative period in Baltimore. These years, while characterized by financial hardship and professional struggle, had been crucial for his development as a writer. He had found his distinctive voice in both poetry and prose, had begun to gain recognition for his work, and had established connections that would support his emerging career. He had also formed the family bonds with Maria and Virginia Clem that would provide emotional stability amid the turbulence of his professional life. As he returned to Richmond, the city of his childhood now transformed by his adult experiences and ambitions, Poe carried with him both the literary promise he had developed in Baltimore and the personal attachments that would sustain him through the challenges ahead. The Baltimore years had witnessed Poe's transformation from a failed military cadet with poetic aspirations to a professional writer with a developing reputation. His experiences during this period, the poverty and uncertainty, the literary experimentation, the formation of new family bonds, and the first taste of professional recognition, shaped both his personal identity and his artistic vision. The themes that would dominate his mature work: death and loss, psychological extremity, the search for beauty amid suffering, the thin line between reason and madness, reflected not only his literary influences, but also the lived experiences of these formative years in Baltimore. As Poe prepared to assume his new role at the Southern Literary Messenger, he stood at a pivotal moment in his career. The position offered him the stability and platform he had long sought, but it also presented new challenges and expectations. His success would depend not only on his creative talents, but also on his ability to navigate the practical demands of magazine production, the social complexities of Richmond society, and the personal responsibilities of his evolving relationship with Virginia. The young writer who had struggled in obscurity in Baltimore was about to step onto a more public stage, where his distinctive literary voice would reach a wider audience and provoke both admiration and controversy. Edgar Allan Poe arrived in Richmond in late September 1835 to assume his position at the Southern Literary Messenger with a mixture of hope and determination. The city he returned to was both familiar and strange. The setting of his childhood and adolescence, now viewed through the lens of his adult experiences and ambitions. Richmond in the mid-1830s was a prosperous commercial center of approximately 20,000 inhabitants, with an established social hierarchy dominated by old Virginia families. As the capital of Virginia, it combined political importance with economic vitality, its position on the James River facilitating trade and transportation. The offices of the Southern Literary Messenger were located on 15th Street near Main Street in the commercial heart of the city. The magazine, founded in August 1834 by Thomas Willis White, was still in its infancy when Poe joined the staff. White, a printer by trade with limited literary background, had established the Messenger with the ambitious goal of creating a quality literary journal that would represent Southern culture and interests while competing with the established magazines of the Northeast. The publication struggled in its early months, facing financial difficulties and an uncertain identity. Poe's arrival transformed the Messenger. He brought to the position not only his creative talents, but also a clear editorial vision and a willingness to engage in the literary controversies of the day. His responsibilities were extensive and varied. He wrote fiction and poetry for the magazine, contributed book reviews and critical essays, corresponded with contributors, and assisted with the practical aspects of production. This immersion in every facet of magazine publishing provided Poe with valuable experience that would inform his later editorial positions and his understanding of the American literary marketplace. As a critic, Poe quickly established a distinctive voice and approach. His reviews were characterized by analytical rigor, attention to technical details of composition, and an uncompromising honesty that sometimes bordered on harshness. He set high standards for literary achievement and did not hesitate to criticize works that failed to meet them, regardless of the author's reputation or popularity. This critical stance earned him the nickname the Tomahawk Man, and began to generate controversy in literary circles, with some praising his integrity and others condemning what they saw as unnecessary severity. Poe's critical essays from this period reveal his developing literary theories and aesthetic principles. He emphasized the importance of unity of effect in literary works, arguing that every element should contribute to a single predetermined emotional impact. He valued originality and innovation over adherence to tradition or imitation of established models. And he insisted on precision and economy in language, criticizing excessive ornamentation or verbosity. These principles, articulated in his reviews and essays, would guide his own creative work and influence subsequent generations of writers and critics. While establishing himself professionally at the Messenger, Poe also took steps to create a stable personal life. In October 1835, he wrote to Maria Clem, inviting her and Virginia to join him in Richmond. His letter expressed both his longing for their company and his confidence in his ability to support them through his work at the magazine. "I am getting a name which will yet enable me to give you a home," he wrote, revealing both his ambition and his commitment to providing for the women who had become his family. Maria and Virginia arrived in Richmond in late October, initially staying at a boarding house while Poe established himself at the Messenger. Their presence provided him with emotional support and domestic stability during a period of intense professional activity. The family was reunited, and Poe's relationship with Virginia continued to develop, moving toward formalization of their marriage. On May 16, 1836, Edgar Allan Poe and Virginia Eliza Clem were married in Richmond, with Presbyterian minister Reverend Amasa Converse officiating. Virginia was 13 years old. Poe was 27. The marriage certificate again listed Virginia's age as 21, continuing the deception begun with the Baltimore marriage license. This misrepresentation suggests awareness that their age difference might provoke disapproval even in a society where young brides were not uncommon. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by Virginia's mother and a few witnesses. Following the marriage, the family established a household together, with Maria Clem continuing to play a significant role in managing domestic affairs and supporting both Poe and Virginia. The nature of Poe's marriage to Virginia has been the subject of much speculation and debate. Contemporary accounts describe their relationship as unusually devoted and tender, with Poe treating his young wife with gentle consideration. Virginia is portrayed as sweet-natured, musically talented, and deeply attached to her husband. Some biographers have suggested that the relationship remained platonic, at least initially, given Virginia's extreme youth, while others argue that it developed into a conventional marriage as she matured. Whatever its precise nature, the marriage provided Poe with emotional stability and domestic comfort during a period of professional growth and creative productivity. Under Poe's editorial guidance, the Southern Literary Messenger flourished. Circulation increased dramatically from approximately 700 subscribers when he joined to around 3,500 by 1836. The magazine gained a reputation for literary quality and critical integrity, attracting contributions from notable writers and engaging with significant cultural and intellectual issues of the day. Poe's own work featured prominently in its pages, including stories like Berenice, Morella, and The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall, as well as numerous reviews and critical pieces. Despite this professional success, tensions developed between Poe and Thomas Willis White. The precise nature of their disagreements remains unclear, but they likely involved a combination of personal and professional factors. White may have been concerned about Poe's occasionally erratic behavior, possibly related to alcohol consumption. He may have objected to the harshness of some of Poe's reviews, fearing alienation of readers or contributors. And there may have been disagreements about compensation or editorial control. Whatever the specific issues, the relationship deteriorated to the point where Poe's position at the magazine became untenable. In January 1837, Poe left the Southern Literary Messenger. His departure marked the end of his first significant editorial position and necessitated another geographical relocation. With Virginia and Maria Clem, he moved to New York City, hoping to find new opportunities in the publishing center of the country. The family arrived in New York in February 1837, taking lodgings in a boarding house while Poe sought employment. This period coincided with the financial panic of 1837, which triggered a severe economic depression affecting all sectors of American society, including publishing. The timing could hardly have been worse for a writer seeking to establish himself in a new city. Poe's time in New York proved brief and disappointing. Despite his growing reputation, he struggled to find steady employment or to place his work with local publications. The economic downturn had forced many magazines to reduce their operations or close entirely, limiting opportunities for contributors and editors alike. After approximately 6 months of frustration and financial hardship, Poe decided to try his luck in Philadelphia, then a major center of American publishing with numerous magazines and literary journals. The family relocated to Philadelphia in late 1838, finding lodgings in a boarding house on Arch Street. Philadelphia offered a more promising environment for Poe's talents. The city had a vibrant literary culture, with established magazines like Graham's, Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, and Godey's Lady's Book providing potential outlets for his work. It also had a more developed community of writers, editors, and publishers than Richmond, creating opportunities for professional connections and collaborations. In Philadelphia, Poe began to rebuild his career. He placed stories and reviews in various publications, gradually re-establishing his reputation after the setback of leaving the Messenger. In May 1839, he achieved a significant breakthrough when he was hired as assistant editor of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, a monthly publication featuring fiction, poetry, reviews, and articles on topics of interest to its primarily male readership. The position provided a modest but regular income of $10 per week and a platform for Poe's work as both a critic and a creative writer. William E. Burton, the magazine's owner and editor, was an English-born actor and theatrical manager who had established the publication in 1837. His relationship with Poe was complex and ultimately contentious. While he recognized and valued Poe's talents, he had reservations about his assistant's temperament and reliability. For his part, Poe chafed under Burton's supervision and harbored ambitions to establish his own magazine, a dream he would pursue intermittently throughout his career. During his time at Burton's, Poe continued to develop as a writer and critic. He published some of his most significant stories in the magazine, including The Fall of the House of Usher, William Wilson, and The Man That Was Used Up. These tales, with their psychological depth, Gothic atmosphere, and innovative narrative techniques, represent Poe at the height of his powers as a fiction writer. He also continued his critical work, reviewing contemporary literature with his characteristic combination of analytical precision and uncompromising judgment. The Fall of the House of Usher, published in September 1839, exemplifies Poe's mature fiction. The story, with its decaying mansion, its psychologically complex characters, and its atmosphere of impending doom, creates a unified effect of dread and melancholy. Its exploration of themes like the disintegration of family, the thin line between sanity and madness, and the return of repressed emotions reflects Poe's deepening psychological insight and his ability to use Gothic conventions to explore profound human concerns. The tale's structural precision and its careful modulation of tone demonstrate his growing mastery of the short story form. William Wilson, published in October 1839, reveals another facet of Poe's fiction. This tale of a man haunted by his doppelganger explores themes of conscience, moral responsibility, and the divided self. Drawing on elements of Poe's own experiences at school in England, the story combines psychological realism with supernatural suggestion, creating an ambiguity that enhances its power. The protagonist's final confrontation with his double, which proves to be a form of self-destruction, offers a powerful metaphor for the internal conflicts that can tear an individual apart. In June 1840, Poe's relationship with Burton deteriorated to the breaking point, leading to his departure from the magazine. The immediate cause was Burton's decision to sell the publication, a move that threatened Poe's position and undermined his hopes of eventually taking over editorial control. However, the split also reflected deeper incompatibilities between the two men's temperaments and visions for the magazine. Poe's departure from Burton's created another period of financial uncertainty for him and his family, though his growing reputation as a writer and critic provided some cushion against complete destitution. This period of uncertainty proved relatively brief. In February 1841, George Rex Graham purchased Burton's Gentleman's Magazine and merged it with his own publication, The Casket, to create Graham's Magazine. Graham, recognizing Poe's talents and reputation, hired him as editor at a salary of $800 per year, a significant improvement over his compensation at Burton's. This position represented the peak of Poe's editorial career, giving him substantial influence over one of America's most prestigious literary magazines and a stable financial foundation for his family. Under Poe's editorial guidance, Graham's magazine flourished, reaching a circulation of about 25,000. an unprecedented figure for an American literary magazine of that era. The publication featured works by many of the leading American writers of the day, including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, and James Fenimore Cooper. Poe continued to contribute his own fiction and criticism, using the magazine as a platform for some of his most significant work, including The Murders in the Rue Morgue, generally considered the first modern detective story. Published in Graham's in April 1841, The Murders in the Rue Morgue introduced C. Auguste Dupin, a brilliant amateur detective who solves crimes through a combination of careful observation and logical deduction. The story established many of the conventions that would define the detective genre. The eccentric but brilliant investigator, the less insightful narrator companion, the seemingly impossible crime, the misleading clues, and the dramatic revelation of the solution. Poe's creation of this influential literary form reflected both his interest in cryptography and puzzles and his belief in the power of rational analysis to penetrate mysteries and reveal hidden truths. Poe followed The Murders in the Rue Morgue with 2 additional Dupin stories: The Mystery of Marie Roget, 1842–1843, and The Purloined Letter, 1844. Together, these tales established the template for detective fiction that would later be developed by writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie, and countless others. They demonstrated Poe's ability to combine intellectual puzzles with psychological insight, creating stories that engage both the mind and the emotions. The Dupin tales also revealed Poe's understanding of reader psychology. His recognition that audiences derive satisfaction from attempting to solve mysteries alongside the detective and from witnessing the triumph of reason over apparent chaos. While Poe's professional life flourished during his time at Graham's, his personal life was marked by growing concern over Virginia's health. In January 1842, while singing and playing the piano for guests in their Philadelphia home, Virginia suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage, the first manifestation of the tuberculosis that would eventually claim her life. This episode marked the beginning of a long, intermittent illness characterized by periods of apparent recovery followed by relapses of increasing severity. For Poe, Virginia's illness represented not only the potential loss of his beloved wife, but also a traumatic echo of earlier losses, including those of his mother and Frances Allan, both of whom had died of the same disease. The stress of Virginia's illness, combined with professional frustrations and possibly his own health issues, contributed to a deterioration in Poe's relationship with George Graham. In May 1842, Poe resigned from Graham's magazine, ending the most stable and successful editorial position of his career. The precise reasons for his departure remain unclear. Some accounts suggest that he was drinking heavily during this period and that his behavior had become erratic. Others indicate that he was dissatisfied with the commercial orientation of the magazine and felt constrained by Graham's editorial policies. Whatever the specific causes, Poe's resignation represented another professional setback and created new financial pressures for his family, at a time when Virginia's illness was already causing emotional strain and medical expenses. Following his departure from Graham's, Poe once again focused on his long-standing dream of establishing his own magazine. He developed plans for a publication to be called The Stylus, which would maintain high literary standards while avoiding what he saw as the commercialism and pandering to popular taste that characterized many existing magazines. He sought subscribers and financial backers, traveling to Washington, D.C. in March 1843 to meet with potential supporters. Despite his efforts and the growing recognition of his literary talents, the Stylus never materialized, remaining an unfulfilled ambition that Poe would continue to pursue until the end of his life. The period from 1835 to 1842 represented both the peak of Poe's professional success as an editor and a time of significant creative development. His work at the Southern Literary Messenger, Burton's, and Graham's established him as a major figure in American literary journalism. Respected, if sometimes feared, for his critical acumen and editorial judgment. His fiction from this period, including The Fall of the House of Usher, William Wilson, and The Murders in the Rue Morgue, demonstrated his mastery of multiple genres and his ability to combine intellectual complexity with emotional power. And his marriage to Virginia, despite the challenges posed by her illness, provided him with a domestic stability that supported his creative work and emotional well-being. However, this period also revealed patterns that would continue to complicate Poe's life and career. His difficulty maintaining long-term professional relationships, his financial insecurity despite his evident talents, his vulnerability to health issues that may have included alcoholism, and his tendency to sabotage opportunities through impulsive behavior or unrealistic expectations. As he entered the next phase of his career, without the structure and support of a regular editorial position, these patterns would become increasingly problematic, contributing to the personal and professional challenges that marked his final years. Following his departure from Graham's magazine in May 1842, Edgar Allan Poe entered a period characterized by increasing literary recognition coupled with mounting personal and financial difficulties. Without the security of a regular editorial position, he was forced to rely on freelance writing, occasional lectures, and the support of friends and admirers. This precarious existence created constant anxiety about providing for his family, particularly as Virginia's health continued to deteriorate and medical expenses accumulated. The Poe family moved frequently during this period, seeking affordable accommodations as their financial situation fluctuated. In 1843, they relocated from Philadelphia to a small cottage in Fordham, New York, now part of the Bronx. The cottage, a modest wooden structure with small rooms and simple furnishings, provided a peaceful setting away from urban distractions, but offered little protection against the harsh New York winters. Here, surrounded by rural landscapes that contrasted with his previous urban residences, Poe continued to write and to care for Virginia, whose condition was steadily worsening. Despite these challenges, the years 1842 to 1845 represented a period of significant literary achievement for Poe. In April 1843, his story, The Gold Bug, won a $100 prize in a contest sponsored by the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper. This tale, combining elements of adventure, cryptography, and treasure hunting, became one of his most popular works during his lifetime. Its protagonist's methodical decoding of a cryptic message to locate buried pirate treasure demonstrated Poe's fascination with puzzles and codes, while its setting on Sullivan's Island near Charleston drew on his experiences during his army service at Fort Moultrie. In January 1845, Poe achieved his greatest popular success with the publication of The Raven in the New York Evening Mirror. The poem, with its hypnotic rhythm, its gothic atmosphere, and its portrayal of inconsolable grief, captured the public imagination in a way that none of his previous works had done. The Raven was reprinted in numerous publications, recited in drawing rooms and on lecture platforms, and even parodied, the surest sign of popular impact. For the first time, Poe became a literary celebrity, recognized on the streets of New York and sought after for autographs and public appearances. The success of The Raven led to increased demand for Poe's work from publishers and readers alike. In 1845, Wiley and Putnam published 2 volumes of his writing, Tales in June and The Raven and Other Poems in November. These collections, representing the first substantial publication of his work by a major publishing house, helped to consolidate his literary reputation and reach a wider audience than his magazine publications had done. The Tales volume included some of his most significant stories, such as The Fall of the House of Usher, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and The Gold Bug, presenting them in a format that emphasized their artistic unity and their author's distinctive vision. Poe's newfound celebrity also created opportunities for public speaking, an avenue he explored with mixed results. He delivered lectures on American poetry and on the principles of literary composition, most notably the poetic principle, which articulated his theories about the essential qualities and purposes of poetry. These lectures, while intellectually substantial, were not always well attended or financially successful. Poe's reserved manner and his tendency to speak in a low, sometimes monotonous voice limited his effectiveness as a public performer, despite the brilliance of his ideas and the precision of his language. In October 1845, Poe became editor and eventually owner of the Broadway Journal, a New York literary magazine. This position seemed to fulfill his long-standing ambition to control his own publication, but the reality proved disappointing. The journal struggled financially from the beginning, with limited circulation and advertising revenue. Poe's editorial approach, emphasizing literary quality over popular appeal, failed to generate the commercial success needed to sustain the publication. By January 1846, after just 3 months of ownership, he was forced to cease publication, marking the end of his final attempt to establish himself as a magazine proprietor. Throughout this period, Poe continued to develop his critical voice, often engaging in literary controversies that enhanced his reputation for intellectual fearlessness, but also created enemies within the literary establishment. His series, The Literati of New York City, published in Godey's Lady's Book in 1846, provided incisive, sometimes caustic assessments of his contemporaries, combining genuine critical insight with personal grudges and provocative opinions. These pieces generated significant attention and controversy, reinforcing Poe's image as a formidable, uncompromising, critical presence in American letters. Poe's most significant literary feud during this period was with the Boston literary establishment, particularly Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In a series of articles beginning in 1842, Poe accused Longfellow of plagiarism and of producing derivative, overly sentimental poetry. These attacks, while containing elements of legitimate critical assessment, also reflected Poe's complex feelings about his own position in American literature and his resentment of Longfellow's greater commercial success and social acceptance. The Longfellow War, as it came to be known, damaged Poe's reputation in some circles, but also demonstrated his willingness to challenge established literary hierarchies and to demand original, authentic American expression. As Poe's literary battles continued, his personal life was increasingly dominated by Virginia's illness. By 1846, her condition had worsened significantly with frequent hemorrhages and declining strength. The family's poverty made it difficult to provide her with adequate care or comfort. According to some accounts, they sometimes lacked money for food and firewood during the winter months, relying on the charity of friends and neighbors. Poe himself was showing signs of physical and emotional strain, possibly exacerbated by alcohol use and by what some modern medical historians suggest may have been a neurological disorder. On January 30, 1847, Virginia Eliza Clem Poe died at the cottage in Fordham, finally succumbing to the tuberculosis that had afflicted her for 5 years. She was 24 years old. Her death, while not unexpected given the progression of her illness, devastated Poe. He had nursed her through years of decline, witnessing her suffering and maintaining hope for her recovery despite increasing evidence of its impossibility. With her death, he lost not only his wife, but also a central focus of his daily life and a source of the domestic stability that had sustained him through professional disappointments and financial hardships. Virginia's death plunged Poe into a period of profound grief and emotional instability. Friends who visited him at the Fordham cottage in the weeks following her death found him alternately despondent and feverishly agitated. He had difficulty sleeping and eating, and his health deteriorated noticeably. Some accounts suggest that he turned more heavily to alcohol during this period, seeking temporary escape from his grief and loneliness. His writing output declined significantly, reflecting his emotional and physical exhaustion. Despite his personal suffering, Poe managed to produce some significant work during this period of mourning. In February 1847, he published Ulalume in the American Whig Review. This poem, with its dreamlike atmosphere, its ghostly imagery, and its theme of unconscious return to the site of loss, reflects Poe's grief over Virginia's death and his preoccupation with mortality. Its deliberately hypnotic rhythm and its use of repetition and internal rhyme create a musical effect that enhances its emotional impact, demonstrating Poe's continuing technical mastery even in the midst of personal crisis. Later in 1847, as Poe began to emerge from the initial shock of bereavement, he wrote Eureka, a prose poem that he considered his masterpiece. This ambitious work presents a cosmological theory that combines scientific speculation, philosophical reflection, and poetic intuition. In it, Poe attempts nothing less than an explanation of the nature and origin of the universe, drawing on contemporary scientific theories but extending them through his own imaginative and intellectual leaps. While largely dismissed by scientists of his time, Eureka anticipates some aspects of later scientific developments, including the Big Bang Theory and concepts of an expanding and contracting universe. Eureka reveals the breadth of Poe's intellectual interests and his willingness to transcend conventional boundaries between literature, philosophy, and science. It also reflects his spiritual searching in the aftermath of Virginia's death, as he grappled with questions of cosmic purpose and the possibility of reunion beyond death. The work's combination of rational analysis and intuitive insight, its movement between the infinitesimal and the infinite, and its ultimate vision of universal unity represent a culmination of themes and approaches that had characterized Poe's work throughout his career. The period from 1842 to 1847 thus encompassed both Poe's greatest public success and some of his most profound personal suffering. The publication of The Raven brought him the wide recognition that had previously eluded him, establishing him as a major figure in American literature. His collections, Tales, and The Raven and Other Poems presented his work in forms that emphasized its artistic coherence and significance. And his critical writings, despite the controversies they sometimes generated, helped to establish higher standards for American literature and to articulate principles of composition that would influence subsequent generations of writers. At the same time, these years witnessed the slow decline and death of Virginia, the failure of Poe's attempt to establish his own magazine, and his continuing financial insecurity despite his growing literary reputation. The contrast between his intellectual achievements and his practical difficulties created tensions that affected both his personal well-being and his creative work. As he entered the final 2 years of his life, Poe carried with him both the hard-won recognition of his literary genius and the accumulated weight of personal losses and professional disappointments that had marked his turbulent career. In the aftermath of Virginia's death in January 1847, Edgar Allan Poe entered the final phase of his life, a period marked by emotional instability, creative resurgence, romantic complications, and ultimately his own mysterious death. As he emerged from the initial shock of bereavement, Poe found himself in a paradoxical position. His literary reputation had never been higher, yet his personal life had never been more fragmented. Without Virginia, and with Maria Clem aging and in poor health herself, the domestic stability that had anchored him through previous difficulties was severely compromised. The cottage in Fordham, once a home filled with Virginia's presence, became a place haunted by memories. Poe continued to live there with Maria Clem through 1847, but the setting that had previously offered rural tranquility now seemed to intensify his isolation and grief. Visitors during this period describe Poe as gaunt and distracted, subject to mood swings that ranged from feverish animation to profound melancholy. His health, never robust, deteriorated further under the strain of emotional distress, possible alcohol use, and the physical toll of years of overwork and inadequate self-care. Despite these challenges, Poe managed to maintain some literary productivity. In addition to Ulalume and Eureka, he wrote several essays and reviews, continuing his critical engagement with contemporary literature even as his creative energies fluctuated. He also began to seek more actively the company and support of friends and admirers, perhaps recognizing that isolation would only deepen his emotional and physical decline. Among those who provided assistance during this difficult period were Marie-Louise Shue, a nurse who had helped care for Virginia during her final illness, and Sarah Helen Whitman, a poet with whom Poe would later develop a romantic relationship. By early 1848, Poe's emotional state had stabilized somewhat, allowing him to resume more regular literary activity and public appearances. In February, he delivered a lecture on the universe, based on the ideas developed in Eureka, at the Society Library in New York. The lecture attracted a substantial audience, reflecting Poe's continuing public appeal despite his personal difficulties. However, the cosmological theories he presented were met with skepticism by many listeners, who found them too speculative and insufficiently grounded in established scientific principles. This reception disappointed Poe, who considered Eureka his most important work and hoped it would secure his intellectual legacy beyond his poetry and fiction. The spring and summer of 1848 saw Poe traveling more extensively than he had in previous years, perhaps seeking distraction from grief or pursuing new opportunities for lectures and publications. He visited Providence, Rhode Island, where he met Sarah Helen Whitman, a widow and poet with whom he had previously corresponded. Their meeting initiated a complex romantic relationship that would become one of the defining elements of Poe's final years. Whitman, intelligent, literary, and spiritually inclined, represented a different type of companion than Virginia had been, an intellectual peer rather than a dependent protégé. Poe's courtship of Whitman was passionate but troubled from the beginning. He was attracted to her literary sensibility and her interest in the transcendental and the supernatural, which resonated with aspects of his own work. She, in turn, was drawn to his literary genius and his romantic intensity. However, Whitman's family and friends opposed the relationship, concerned about Poe's reputation for instability and possible alcoholism. Whitman herself harbored doubts about Poe's reliability and his readiness for a new relationship so soon after Virginia's death. Despite these obstacles, Poe pursued the relationship with characteristic intensity. In October 1848, he attempted by taking laudanum after a perceived rejection by Whitman, an act that revealed the depth of his emotional fragility and his tendency toward dramatic, self-destructive gestures when faced with disappointment or abandonment. He recovered from this episode and continued his pursuit, eventually securing a conditional engagement from Whitman in December 1848. The conditions included his pledge to abstain completely from alcohol, a promise that reflected both Whitman's concerns about his drinking and the temperance movement's growing influence in American society. The engagement proved short-lived. On December 23, 1848, the day before the planned wedding, Whitman received an anonymous letter warning her about Poe's alleged violation of his temperance pledge. Whether the accusation was true or false, it provided Whitman with grounds to break the engagement, which she did immediately. Poe, devastated by this rejection, returned to Fordham and to the care of Maria Clem, having lost another chance at rebuilding some semblance of domestic happiness. During this same period, Poe maintained a complex relationship with another literary woman, Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton. Shelton had been Poe's sweetheart in his youth in Richmond, before his departure for the University of Virginia. Their youthful romance had ended when Shelton's father intercepted Poe's letters during his university year, leading her to believe he had forgotten her. She subsequently married another man, becoming a respectable Richmond matron. Now widowed and financially independent, she reconnected with Poe during his visits to Richmond in 1848 and 1849, rekindling elements of their earlier attachment. The nature of Poe's feelings for Shelton remains somewhat ambiguous. Some biographers suggest that his pursuit of her was motivated primarily by her financial security and the stability she could offer, while others argue that genuine affection, perhaps enhanced by nostalgia for their youthful romance, played a significant role. Whatever his motivations, Poe actively courted Shelton during his final months, securing a tentative agreement to marry from her by the summer of 1849. This engagement, like the one with Whitman, was conditional on Poe's sobriety and stability, requirements that reflected the concerns his behavior had generated among those who knew him well. Amid these romantic complications, Poe continued to write and to develop new literary projects. In 1848, he worked on The Bells, a poem that showcases his mastery of sound and rhythm to evoke different emotional states associated with bells of various types, from the joyful tinkling of sleigh bells to the solemn tolling of funeral bells. The poem underwent multiple revisions, growing from 17 lines in its first draft to 113 lines in its final form, published posthumously in 1849. Its progression from merriment to mourning may reflect Poe's own emotional journey and his preoccupation with mortality in the wake of Virginia's death. Another significant work from this period is Annabel Lee, likely written in May 1849. This ballad-like poem tells the story of a love so intense that it transcends death, with the narrator continuing to feel united with his deceased beloved despite the separation of death. The poem's setting by the sea, its emphasis on a love formed in youth, and its defiance of the boundaries between life and death create a powerful expression of enduring attachment. While not explicitly autobiographical, Annabel Lee clearly draws on Poe's experience of losing Virginia and his refusal to relinquish their connection even after her physical death. In June 1849, Poe left New York for what would be his final journey. His plan was to travel south to Richmond, where he hoped to secure subscribers for a revived version of his magazine project, The Stylus, and perhaps to finalize his engagement to Elmira Shelton. He also intended to visit Philadelphia to collect a payment owed to him and to meet with literary contacts there. The journey was undertaken with limited funds and against the backdrop of a cholera epidemic that was affecting parts of the eastern United States, adding physical risk to the emotional and professional uncertainties Poe faced. Poe's time in Richmond during the summer of 1849 represented a brief period of relative stability and hope. He delivered a successful lecture on the poetic principle to an appreciative audience, reconnected with friends and acquaintances from his earlier years in the city, and continued his courtship of Elmira Shelton. He also joined the Sons of Temperance, a fraternal organization dedicated to abstinence from alcohol, suggesting a genuine attempt to address the drinking problems that had complicated his life and relationships. For a few weeks, it seemed possible that Poe might establish a new life in Richmond, supported by Shelton's financial security and the goodwill of the community where he had spent much of his youth. This period of promise was short-lived. On September 27, 1849, Poe left Richmond for Baltimore, intending to travel on to Philadelphia and then to New York to settle his affairs and bring Maria Clem back to Richmond for his planned wedding to Shelton. The exact circumstances of his journey and the events that followed remain one of the most mysterious episodes in American literary history. What is known with certainty is that on October 3, 1849, Poe was found in a state of delirium outside Ryan's Tavern, or Gunner's Hall, in Baltimore, wearing clothes that were not his own and unable to explain his condition or how he had arrived there. Joseph W. Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun who recognized Poe despite his disheveled state, arranged for him to be taken to Washington College Hospital. There, Poe was treated by Dr. John J. Moran, who later provided an account of the writer's final days. According to Moran, Poe alternated between periods of calm and violent delirium, calling out the name Reynolds, whose identity remains unknown, and exhibiting symptoms consistent with various conditions, from alcohol withdrawal to physical injury to infectious disease. Despite medical attention, his condition deteriorated rapidly. On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died at Washington College Hospital. He was 40 years old. His last words, according to Dr. Moran, were, "Lord help my poor soul," though the reliability of this report has been questioned by some historians. The cause of Poe's death was recorded as congestion of the brain, a vague diagnosis that could encompass numerous actual conditions. No autopsy was performed, and the medical records have been lost, leaving the precise cause of his death as one of the enduring mysteries in literary history. Numerous theories have been proposed to explain Poe's final illness and death. The most common include alcoholism and its complications, various infectious diseases such as cholera, tuberculosis, or syphilis, physical trauma from a beating or accident, poisoning, rabies, and various metabolic or neurological disorders. Each theory has its advocates and evidence, but none has been definitively proven. The mystery surrounding his death seems fitting for a writer whose work often explored the boundaries between life and death, reality and illusion, and whose own life was marked by enigmas and contradictions. Poe's funeral was held on October 8, 1849, at Westminster Hall and Burying Ground in Baltimore. The service was brief and sparsely attended, with only a handful of relatives and acquaintances present. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the Presbyterian Cemetery section of the grounds. The hasty, unceremonious nature of his burial reflected both the circumstances of his death and his marginal status in respectable society, despite his literary achievements. It would be 26 years before a proper monument was erected to mark his grave, following a campaign led by teachers and students from a local school. News of Poe's death spread quickly through literary circles, generating responses that ranged from genuine mourning to barely disguised satisfaction. His longtime adversary Rufus Wilmot Griswold seized the opportunity to shape Poe's posthumous reputation by publishing a scathing obituary in the New York Tribune, describing him as a misanthropic, envious, unstable man without moral susceptibility, whose life was a series of startling alternations of ambition and indolence. This character assassination, written under a pseudonym but widely known to be Griswold's work, was followed by a more extensive biographical memoir included in an edition of Poe's works that Griswold edited, ostensibly at Poe's request. Griswold's portrait of Poe as a drug-addicted, alcoholic madman whose brilliant but disturbing work emerged from personal depravity rather than artistic control had a profound and lasting impact on Poe's reputation. While some contemporaries challenged this characterization, notably John Sarton, George Lippard, and Sarah Helen Whitman, Griswold's position as Poe's literary executor gave his version an authority that was difficult to counter. The image of Poe as a tortured, self-destructive genius whose life mirrored the Gothic horrors of his fiction became firmly established in the public imagination, influencing interpretations of his work and life for generations. The circumstances of Poe's death, found delirious in the streets of Baltimore, dying alone in a hospital among strangers, seem to confirm this tragic narrative. The mystery surrounding his final days added an element of Gothic drama that aligned perfectly with the themes of his fiction and poetry, Whether accurate or not, the story of Poe's death became inseparable from his literary legacy, creating a mythology that enhanced the impact of his work even as it distorted understanding of the man who created it. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Poe's literary reputation in America was significantly damaged by Griswold's attacks and by the general association of his work with morbidity and moral questionable themes. However, his influence began to grow in Europe, particularly in France, where translations of his stories appeared in the early 1850s. Charles Baudelaire, recognizing in Poe a kindred spirit, undertook extensive translations of his work, introducing him to French readers and championing his artistic vision. Baudelaire's advocacy was crucial in establishing Poe's international reputation and in presenting him as a serious artist, rather than merely a sensationalist or a cautionary tale of talent destroyed by personal demons. Poe's death at the age of 40 cut short a literary career that, despite its brevity, had already transformed American literature in multiple ways. His technical innovations in poetry, his development of the modern short story, his creation of the detective genre, his pioneering work in science fiction, and his exploration of psychological states and existential themes established new possibilities for literary expression that would influence countless writers in the decades and centuries to come. The circumstances of his death, while tragic, added a final layer of mystery to a life already marked by enigma and contradiction, ensuring that interest in both his work and his biography would endure long after the controversies of his lifetime had faded into history.